All right, welcome to the Competitive Advantage Talks presented by Wasserman at the 2018 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Corey Brumbergs. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it's my pleasure to introduce this presentation, The Elam Ending, examining the necessity and soundness of eliminating the game clock from the final portion of every basketball game. If you have any questions at the end, just raise your hand, and you'll get called on. And with that, please join me in welcoming Nick Elam from Ball State.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I want to thank all the organizers of the conference for this opportunity to speak. And I want to say a special thanks to Sam Feder, who's one of the student organizers, for all of his help. He's been a big help. I know they do incredible work to make this a first-class event, and so I'm excited to be here to speak about the hybrid duration format for basketball, also known as the Elam Ending. And I do believe that basketball would benefit by eliminating the game clock from the final portion of every game. We have seen some basketball leagues and events that eliminate the game clock from overtime, but I actually think they should extend that concept to regulation. And so to get there, I'll start by talking about why this is necessary, some of the phenomena that happen late in games that are attributable to the clock. And during this part of the talk, I will be critical of the game, so I think it's important to point out that I'm a huge basketball fan. I absolutely love basketball. I'm not like the guys that Zach Lowe was talking about earlier today. So I think this is a way to make a great sport even greater. And the idea is not to change basketball. In fact, it's to do the opposite. It's to preserve a more natural style of play through the end of every game and to give us more real basketball during the late stages. Then we'll move on to a specific trait that is unique to basketball compared to other sports that use a clock that would actually allow basketball to abandon its clock for part of the game where other sports are still must be dependent on the clock. And when basketball was born, it was truly dependent on a clock. It needed a clock, but the concept of a game clock in basketball might be outdated to an extent. We'll talk about the logistics of the idea itself, the hybrid duration format, the Elam Ending, and how a vision became a reality and seeing it in its initial implementation and how it worked during TBT Jamboree in 2017. So, and then this is going to kind of be the express version of this talk, so anything that we can't get to, I'll point you toward a post at the end with about 20,000 words worth of answers to questions that I anticipate. So, to talk about some of the phenomena, this is just a partial list of phenomena that we see late in games, the way that the quality of play deteriorates late in basketball games. And the ones that are in bold, I'll share some more specific data here in a little bit. But we heard a panel yesterday morning speak of those in the game speaking at length and citing very specific reasons why deliberate fouling late in games is a legitimate concern and is something that they've tried to address going back to the 1950s. And so for me, as a basketball fan, I see a problem that it's an unsightly form of basketball. It's not an appealing style of basketball. But the other part that's troubling about it is it's one of two major forces working against trailing teams that makes the end of games very predictable, too predictable. Because if a team's already behind, now they have to hand away free points to their opponent when they're on defense, and then when they're on offense, they have to rush and force up ugly shots. And so it's really surprising to think about how many really big games and how many really good basketball games kind of end with a whimper, and late comebacks are far too rare. On this slide, I think maybe the most interesting thing to look at is that second bullet point. Basketball is absolutely one of the most exciting sports to enjoy in the moment as the game unfolds. But basketball games, maybe more so than some of our other favorite sports, is vulnerable to kind of fading from memory after the fact. And I think it's because of a combination of factors that applies to basketball and not to our other favorite sports, where basketball has a very fluid nature to it. So it's harder to look back and remember very specific scenarios and situations compared to sports that have more discrete action, like baseball or football. There's a lot of scoring in basketball, so it's hard for any specific scoring play to stand out in memory. And there's no guarantee that a basketball game is going to end with any sort of an accomplishment. So again, that combination of factors sometimes mean that some really big games and some really good games don't even really have one signature moment or lasting image to carry on. We go way down the list with some minor concerns, again, that are attributable to the clock. But again, I think this whole list, if you were to get rid of the clock at the end of the game, you could realistically eliminate or alleviate all of these phenomena that we see, and you could still keep all the good stuff that we enjoy about the end of basketball games. So I'm going to share some data here. You really only need to focus on what's in bold, and this is the 4th year of gathering data from NBA and men's college basketball, and this goes all the way through February 18th of this year. And I do gather data by watching the closing minutes of all these games. I can't rely on box scores or play-by-play summaries because that can be misleading for the type of data that I'm trying to gather. So let's talk about the effectiveness, or really the ineffectiveness, of the deliberate fouling strategy that we're very familiar with at the end of games. And this is looking at it by period. So this is any fourth quarter, second half, or overtime where the trailing team resorts to deliberate fouling in the closing minutes. And so you see that it happens in roughly half of the periods. And in most of the periods where it doesn't happen, it's because the trailing team has just said, we give up, we're not even going to bother with trying to catch up, and that's not such a good thing either. But you'll see in that yellow slice, the one that you can barely see, just how difficult it is for a team to actually come back for this strategy to work. Sometimes in the gray, they're able to force overtime, but still, they're going to all this effort, they're catching all the crazy breaks, and they're still just getting it back to 50-50. What I think might be the most interesting part of this is comparing that orange slice to the blue portion, because we already have a pretty good idea that it's hard to complete a comeback using this strategy, but what we're seeing from that comparison is that not only are teams not completing a comeback, they're not even closing the gap at all. When they have to resort to fouling, they are widening their deficit, which isn't a surprise because they're handing away free points, but yet it's still their best option because the clock has such a strong influence. I actually think this might be too generous because during this portion of the game, a lot of times the leading team is willing to give up uncontested layups, so that affects the scoring difference. And college basketball still has the 1-and-1, which I don't really like or understand what it adds to the game. And so they have discussed getting rid of that, and if they were to get rid of the 1-and-1, that would make late comebacks even tougher in college basketball. If we look at an even more straightforward definition, here I don't give you any credit for just closing the gap. Here you have to win the game. So these are all the games where we see that strategy in crunch time. And it's just really striking to see how rarely this strategy works, especially when you consider how often teams have to resort to this at times just to overcome a 1 or 2 or 3 point deficit. It just doesn't work. And even there are some weird games there in the gray where maybe one team fouls in the fourth quarter and then the other team fouls in overtime. But still, do you say, did it work? Did it not work? Both teams did it, and somebody had to win. So again, this is just one major force that works against trailing teams when they're behind. And also, it's an unsightly form of basketball where the quality is deteriorating. And then the other side happens when they are on offense. So now we are looking at what is happening at the true end of a fourth quarter, second half, or overtime, where the game is within 3 points. And we're used to seeing teams over the course of a game score over 1 point per possession. And if you look here, the quality of play just plummets at the end, where it really turns the most important possession of the game into a blooper reel. And I think about what this would look like in another sport. It would be like seeing Mike Trout step up to the plate in the bottom of the ninth and then have to bat left-handed. And it's like, well, I guess that'd be really cool if he got a hit, but I think I'd rather just see him at his best. I don't know why we would want to see our teams and players handcuffed when the game is on the line. We could be a little bit more generous with this definition and look at possessions that don't necessarily come at the very end of these periods, but that could come at the end where the shot clock is turned off. But still, this is not the quality of play that we're used to, just over 0.6 points per possession. Still, the quality is deteriorating. And it's all because of the clock. And so, again, this combination of factors working against trailing teams, quality is deteriorating, outcomes are too predictable, big games, good games that end with a whimper. We look at what is actually happening at the very last moment of a game. What is the very last thing to happen in a basketball game from this sample? and you look at the light blue there, those are the only games that actually ended with a buzzer beater, with a meaningful made basket, the type of ending that we enjoy the most. The portion there in the orange, those are the only other possessions where there was anything still at stake. And then all the other portions there, the game was already in hand, essentially meaningless possessions to end the game. And so, and you look and see that over 60% of the time there in yellow, games end with just a leading player dribbling out the clock. Even a fair amount of the time in the dark blue there, where a game ends with a trailing player dribbling out the clock, saying, let's just go home, we give up. And to go back to the buzzer beaters, because we romanticize about that, and I mean, those are great. So if we look at this sample here, NBA, NCAA, and I'll even throw in the 2016 Olympics, men's and women's basketball. I collected data much the same way for that, and there were 2 buzzer beaters during that play. So now we're looking at over 2,600 games, and only 24 of them actually ended with a buzzer beater, with a meaningful made basket. And I used to have a misconception that they happen much more often than they do, and I just think that's far too rare. And you could even chop that up even more, where if you look at those 24 buzzer beaters, 18 of them came in a tie game. So an example would be the 2016 National Championship. Villanova and Chris Jenkins make a shot to beat North Carolina and win the championship. That was an awesome finish. I will always remember that. That was great. And you think about what was at stake there, where a team where the game was tied at the time the shot was released. If he makes the shot, and he did, you win right then and there. If you miss the shot, well, okay, everybody gets to settle in for 5 minutes of overtime. If we were to get rid of the clock and play to a certain point total instead, you'd have many games where you get down to a sudden death situation like that. And if you make the shot, you win right then and there. And if you miss the shot, nobody gets to settle in for anything. You got to get back on defense and play defense for your life, because the game could end on the very next possession. So even some of those buzzer beaters that we think there's no way this could get any better, I think by getting rid of the clock, we could even enhance those. And so what we're left with then is just 6 do-or-die buzzer beaters out of 2,600 games where the team that won at the buzzer was trailing at the time they released the shot. And those are really cool. There's no doubt about it. But even in those cases, the clock still kind of gets in its own way, because that should just be, we finally get this, all the circumstances align perfectly, where we get this great ending, this perfect ending. It should just be a totally uninhibited celebration. And then we get officials who are just doing their job, running out on the court, blowing their whistle, waving their arms, saying, stop celebrating, stop being excited. We got to go to the monitor and make sure that it was released on time. So all of these things that happen at the end of games, don't blame the leagues for this, blame the clock. This is all attributable to the clock. And so it begs the question, does basketball really need a game clock? And the answer is kinda. So this is a comparison of the scoring rate in basketball to other sports that use a clock. And this is a much smaller sample, but I'm confident that this general relationship would hold for a larger sample. And this wasn't always the case. I mean, what you should really notice here is that basketball stands out from the rest. That wasn't always the case. When basketball was first invented, scoring was much more precious. It was much more closely aligned with these other sports that are truly dependent on a clock. And all these sports do enjoy a benefit by using a clock. It helps to rein in the length of games, and that's very important. But we all see different ways that teams manipulate the clock too late in games, and that is a concern. The only thing is that all these other sports, they're stuck with their clock. There's not enough scoring, or there's not another fundamental accomplishment like outs in baseball where they could realistically get rid of their clock. Basketball is the only one that could get rid of the clock at the end of the game. So again, the clock made sense when basketball was first invented by Dr. James Naismith, but for a long, long time, the idea of a game clock in basketball might just be outdated. So what I'm proposing, and what has been implemented to a limited extent, is that you would eliminate the game clock from the final portion of every game. You would play most of the game with the clock, and you'd get rid of the clock for the last part of it. And again, the idea is not to change the game, it's to do the opposite. It's to preserve a more natural style of play through the end of every game and to give us more real basketball. And again, for all those great finishes that we do enjoy now, it's to keep all the good stuff that we see now and to get rid of the bad stuff. So this begs 2 questions right off the top, which is, when do you shut off the clock, and what do you play to? So this is all written in pencil, but I think the best place to start, and I'll use college basketball as an example, would be to eliminate the clock just after the 4-minute mark in the second half. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that that's around the time where you would see a team with a medium-sized lead start to really slow down, play a passive style, start to manipulate the clock, and then from that point on, the quality of play deteriorates to some extent. Also, that happens to be the last media timeout in college basketball, so that makes for a natural transition point. Now, the really serious flaws that we see, the fouling and the stalling and also the rushing, you don't really see that. I'm sorry, the fouling and the rushing. You don't really see that until the very last minute of a game, but you can't wait too long to shut off the clock or you're going to run into the same problem. So you have to build in enough of an untimed cushion there. So if we're taking out 4 minutes out of a 40-minute game, we're taking out 10% of the game, and we need to add 10% of it back. If you look at scoring rates in college basketball, it's about 70 points per team per game. 10% of 70 is 7, and so you would add 7 to determine the target score. And by the way, for the NBA, I think you would shut off the clock at the 3-minute mark and do +7. So as an example, going back to college basketball, if we were to use this for last year's championship, North Carolina and Gonzaga, it was after that 4-minute mark, the score was 62-60, so you would get rid of the clock at that time. 62 plus 7 is 69, so we're coming back. There's no clock. It's 62-60. First team to 69 wins the game. And the idea is that you would see a cleaner form of basketball, that you would remove some of these unsightly styles of play and some of these major forces working against trailing teams, and that would all combine to give us that fourth bullet point there, that we would have less predictable outcomes, that we would see more late comebacks. And I don't think we would necessarily see an avalanche of additional comebacks, but I do think we would see an uptick. And I think what might be most interesting, or what might be the best, is that I think the outcome of games would be more satisfying whether there's a comeback or not. And the last bullet point there, I think we would absolutely be addicted to the images and the sounds and the traditions and the trivia that go along with walk-off shots. So when I first thought of this idea back in 2007, for a short time I thought, oh, this kind of seems like a gimmick, but I quickly came to believe, and I believe just as strongly now as I ever have, that this is less gimmicky than what we see at the end of games now. So this has been implemented, and I will forever be grateful to John Mugar and Dan Friel and the good folks at TBT for implementing this during the preliminary round play last June, and also for giving it a better name. And so it looked great. It really looked great in action, and it met all of its primary aims. We saw some insane comebacks. You see here, again, this is just out of 11 games, and this is all after we shut off the clock with 4 minutes to go. Teams really closing the gap. The craziest comeback came when a team was down 13 when we shut off the clock. They go on a 14-0 run and then give up the lead and ultimately lose. And you will notice that in a lot of these cases, the team wasn't actually able to complete its comeback. But if you remember the slide we saw earlier, we know how hard it is to complete a comeback under the current format, but we saw teams aren't even closing the gap. When they have to resort to fouling, they are widening their deficit, and here teams certainly were closing the gap because they didn't have to resort to that fouling. We saw some insane finishes. The first three, and I'm kind of moving through this quickly, but the first 3 bullet points there, those are the 3 games that ended with a sudden death or a virtual sudden death scenario, and those were awesome. And at the bottom there, you see the really cool variety of ways that games ended, much cooler than seeing somebody dribble out the clock. We were very conscious of the effect on game time. We were taking out 4 minutes of game time, and we wanted to see roughly an equivalent of hypothetical game time during that untimed final portion. We knew there would be some variation, but what was cool was kind of the two-pronged effect. There's really only one blowout game, but that was the game that ended the quickest, and I think that's what you would want. The one team was clearly superior, and it was like, you know what, let's go get our 7 points and go home. And the other games that lasted longer, the suspense was building. The leading team was not getting to the finish line, and the trailing team was gaining on them. So it had a cool effect on the length of the game. So it was a thrill for me to, I had been playing out games like this in my mind for 10 years, and for me to see this in action was really a thrill. And then for me to go back later and listen and watch the ESPN3 broadcast and to hear some of the comments, it was exactly what I was hoping for. So it looked great and it sounded great. And again, I know I'm moving through this pretty quickly. And I think this would absolutely be a broadcaster's dream. And I will give credit to Matt Martucci, who nailed the call of Josh Selby's walk-off winner. It sounded great. It sounded like a buzzer beater. It sounded like the way we enjoy seeing games end now. And so after seeing it in action, I'm more confident than ever that this concept will live on beyond June of 2017. And so I'm excited to see how it grows and evolves and is fine-tuned going forward. And so the question is, where does it go from here? So I know it would take a long time for this to go to reach the highest levels of NBA or WNBA, college basketball, or Olympics. But I think there's a way that other leagues, semi-pro leagues, and events could adopt this and as a testing ground to see where it goes. And again, we see basketball leagues that have eliminated the game clock from overtime. And I think we should just go one step further and extend that to regulation to keep all the good things that we see at the end of games now and to eliminate the bad stuff. So I appreciate your interest and your attention. And again, if there are anything that we're not able to get to here, if you go to that non-concerns post, you'll find about 20,000 words worth of questions to answers I anticipate, because this certainly does raise a lot of questions. So I thank you for your time. Any questions? If you think of something later, I will be around. I'll be going to some of the basketball-related panels later on. Yes?
Yeah. So what do you mentioned briefly that you could even envision the whole game being played up the clock. So how do you think it would work extending the back? Because you could look at shutting off 8 minutes. You could look at shutting off after a half, and then just according to dividing 35 in the second half.
Well, if I implied that, then I didn't communicate my idea very clearly. I do not think that basketball should eliminate the clock from the whole game, because I think you would see the length of the game vary way too much. So that's why I say that basketball can have the best of both worlds, where it can enjoy the benefit of having a clock, which is to rein in the length of the games, but because it has more scoring than other sports that are truly dependent on a clock, it could get rid of the clock for some of each game. And so then the question is, well, what exactly is the right time to shut off the clock, and what do you play to? I think the good place to start, college basketball, under 4 minutes plus 7, NBA under 3 minutes plus 7. Any of those settings could be adjusted, but I think that would be a good starting point. And for TBT, they normally play a 36-minute game. We talked about under 4 plus 7. We talked about under 4 plus 8, under 3 plus 7, and ultimately went with under 4 plus 7. And I was pushing for under 4 plus 8, but under 4 plus 7 looked pretty good. It worked out pretty well. But again, all that part is written in pencil. The idea in a nutshell is that you play most of the game with the clock, and you play the last part without it. Yes.
Would teams distort how they finish up the last minute or two with the clock, from 4 minutes to 3 minutes?
Great question. So the question then, and I'm not worried about that at all. The question is, well, would a trailing team desperately try to foul then as the time portion of the game winds down? I don't think so, because if you remember back to that slide, we saw, again, when teams resort to fouling, not because it's effective, it's because they don't have any other choice. When that clock hits 0, the game is over, and they don't have any other choice. But while they are fouling, they are widening their deficit. It's truly a counterproductive strategy. The only problem is that that's still their best option under the current format. So I'd like to give them another option, which is to play real basketball. So they wouldn't want to widen their deficit in advance of that untimed final stretch. So I don't think we would see it. If we saw it, I don't think it would work. If for some crazy reason we saw it and it worked and it still became this prevailing strategy, then I think you could adjust the settings on the eliminating, beef up the untimed portion, do something like that, so that teams would not be inclined to do that. So stalling, we saw minimal stalling at TBT for about one possession leading up to that untimed portion. So again, this is where the goal is to either ideally eliminate the flaw, but even if we can't eliminate it, alleviate it. So we saw less stalling, and we saw it at an earlier stage of the game rather than seeing it so prevalently and seeing it in the most important possessions of the game. So that was one example where it didn't quite eliminate that flaw, but we were able to alleviate it, and I think that would carry forward if this format were used. Yes?
Have you looked into the impact of the number that you choose for the points on teams with different styles of play? Like, obviously, if it were 9 points, 3-pointers would be hugely more valuable than, say, 7 points. And a way to sort of, like, not bias that against them.
I think rather than the style of play, I look at scoring rates. So this will have to be our last question here. Scoring rates. So whatever portion of the game you're taking out, you need to try to add an equivalent portion in. So I think you look at just scoring rates, typical scoring rates for that league. Now, I know when you hear the number 7, you think, oh, well, the game could be over in 3 possessions. And that's possible, but again, we normally see about 1 point per possession. So really, you should see about 7 full possessions, which is a good, healthy amount of basketball to see during the final stretch. So that'll have to be the last question, but I will be around again. If there's anything basketball related going on, I'll probably be there. So I appreciate your time and your interest. Thank you very much.